Oh, hello there. Yes, well, another week beginneth. Yes, Seth. Yeah. Anyway, sure it'll be delightful. So far the year has been, hasn't it? Yes. Anyway, today I thought we'd have a closer look at a particular piece in yesterday's Telegraph about the nature of culture and belonging, and as it seems to be a theme for the last few days, history. Yes, we had Jake Wallace Simmons. I don't care. Anyway, it's time to begin forging our new post-DEI culture. Hooray! Yes, indeed. It will be a long march back to the restoration of national pride in our history, traditions, and the British way of life. Might well come back to that as a concept in a short period of time. Yeah, it's worthwhile going through all of it because it has that brilliance of managing to mangle various notions, not the least of which is any sense of history, in particular amongst what we might call minorities in the UK, of which Jake is, let's face it, one. Not like us, he's one of, them. Anyway, let's read, shall we? Yes. Like a vampire with a fatal wound, diversity, equity and inclusion continues to pull furiously at the veins of public life whilst wobbling on its feet. As an orange bullet seemed to lodge in its heart, we must make serious plans for the restoration of our culture. Yes, we and our there, you notice. Yes. Yeah, not entirely sure if that includes me, but you never know. Maybe he'll surprise us later on. No, he won't. For decades... Now, I want you to keep that concept in your mind. Decades here, okay? Because he does talk about decades and generations, and I'm not convinced that he actually knows what a generation is. But anyway, Britain has been in the grip of an elite that has sought to rewrite our values along ideological lines, yes. Worthwhile bearing in mind that Jake is somebody who basically can write anything he wants at any time in the Daily Telegraph. But remember, he's not a member of the elite, okay? People that can do that, like Jake, aren't elitists. It's people like me that can just, speak to a handful of people on YouTube. Yes, it's our fault. Anyway, we again used to take for granted that pride in our history, traditions and way of life was a cherished part of our inheritance. Okay. We felt loyalty towards compatriots, yet welcomed worthy newcomers. Maybe not. As the country would be richer for it. Toleration was reciprocal. Hooray! People would stand for the national anthem before leaving cinemas. And there we go into the classic A history, because the reason why we no longer have the national anthem played, for example, in cinemas is, as every fool know, and you can spot this in a particular episode of Dad's Army, if you want to be picky about it. Yes, I know it's a fiction, but nevertheless it represented a truth that everybody would run out of the cinema whilst the national anthem was playing, so they didn't have to stand for it. That's the reason they got rid of it, because it was so obviously that people were being disrespectful. However, it becomes part of Jake's imagined past. Jake is about 45, 46, so he has no idea of which he talks, because, of course, like me, he wasn't involved at that time. But he is going to certainly try to evoke a past that didn't exist, be it the 50s or the 40s or indeed the 30s, which we might just come on to. Yes, indeed. Today, Britain is unrecognisable. Don't think it is, but okay. At least in its institutions and cultural climate. Yeah, here we go, folks. The British Museum shop promotes David Olus's Inglorious Empire. By Shasha Tharador and Edward Said's Orientalism. Yes, indeed. I'm sure they've got other books in there as well, which Jake won't mind. But imagine that, eh? A bookshop in a museum having books in it. It'd be awful, especially books by, respected authors and respected historians. Oh, not respected by Jake, of course, because as a free speech issue, of course, we can't have books in a bookshop that don't represent the correct way of viewing things, like, the national anthem being played in cinemas. How much we've lost, eh? This week, a jailed Albanian people smuggler was allowed to remain because he'd become a valuable member of society. And again, we get another one of those chicken nuggets style things, which is trying to persuade you, of course, that you really need to give up your human rights. Jake won't give up his, by the way. That'll be up to you, because the elitists are like you lot, deserve to have your human rights taken away because you're not properly British, because you don't stand for the national anthem, even though you never would do. And even if they brought that back in, you would scarper for the exits like everybody else. Not Jake, though. He's a proud patriot. He wouldn't own fealty and loyalty to a distant state or a distant ideology of which, well, is a bit dodgy. Wouldn't do that, would he? No. After a recent parents' evening, I had to complain about critical race theory posters on the school walls. Well, number one, Jake, no, you didn't have to complain, and they weren't critical race theory posters. They were posters promoting concepts that you don't like. You know, when you were talking earlier about, well, you know, tolerance, yeah, it would have been those, wouldn't it? But of course, they would have had a slightly racial element that you would have found, well, distasteful because your libertarian hackles would have been raised. You didn't have to complain, Jake, but you took it upon yourself as a respected non-elite member of society to do so. Such is your right as a parent, no doubt. I hope the school quaking in their boots because, of course, you might well write something in the Telegraph, like you've done here. We'll love a non-bully, don't we? Yes. All right. Anyway, what does modern Britain have in common with the country of our parents? Well, pretty much everything, Jake, okay? Just apropos of nothing, my dad was born in 1920 and took part in the Second World War. He joined the territorials in 1938 after a number of anti-fascist actions like the Battle of Cable Street, whereby, you know, progressive Britons, you know, those elitists, boo-hiss, actually took it upon themselves to, well, tackle fascism on the streets because it was obviously a threat to our way of life. Yes, indeed. And then he went through 39 to 46, and as various people here will no doubt have heard me said, he was on the beaches of Dunkirk, etc. So I don't need to be told about our parents. I'm reasonably aware of that because I had it pretty much from the horse's mouth, particularly the idea of, you know, nasty people with nasty bullying views. Anyway, more of that later. George Orwell responded in The Lion and the Unicorn. Nothing except you happen to be the same person. Even that is less true than it was. Yes, indeed. And of course, you know, all of the right-wingers do love to own George Orwell, who was a committed socialist. Still, that's just a bit of history that I guess Jake knows, but of course he does. But he chooses not to, like so much here. He chooses so much about the history that he wants you to remember, being the elitists that you are. Or is that just me? Hard to say, really. Well, now things may be changing. Hooray! Oh, good. We'll get to recognise our country again. As Amazon, Disney, and Google abandoned DEI under the gaze of Donald Trump, British Telecom has pledged to cut similar initiatives from its bonus scheme, and banks have called on the city regulator to scrap diversity targets. Speaking to the Guardian, Helena Morrissey, who chairs something called the Diversity Project, yeah, you could just tell us what it is, couldn't you, Jake? But of course, that wouldn't actually have the non-sneering bit. Yeah, people often accuse me of sneering, but when I read things like this, it's hard not to. Lamented that her colleagues fear that it's all over, there's no point in us trying anymore. Yes, indeed, because, of course, all of that notion about capitalism being nice is now being stripped away, and all of those kind of whitewashing or pinkwashing or greenwashing initiatives that they had to fork out for are gone. Great, think of all the money they're going to save by, you know, just exactly proving to us the nasty companies that they are. Still, Jake's all in favour of nasty companies because, well, that's reality, and we need to have reality, don't we? Yes, we wouldn't want anything false like history. But restoring Britain is no small job. For decades, that one again, our country has been subjected to a Gramscian long march through the institutions. Yes, he means me there, okay? People like me have plotted somehow or other. You know, we huddle in small groups somewhere, and we plot something, and now we're getting our own way. Yes, it's a particular Gramscian view of the world, and right-wingers do like it, and they always rely on the fact that you haven't actually read Gramsci or don't know anything about him. Yeah, best if you don't. Just trust Jake. He's a very trustworthy man. Combined with mass immigration, yeah, that's all bad, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. We won't mention all of those right-wing conspiracy theories about, Jewish people actually proactively encouraging mass immigration, because that's anti-Semitic. We wouldn't want that. But it's okay for Jake to come out with those things as a notion, you see, because well, he can't be anti-Semitic, can he? No, good Zionist boy that he is, of course, can't be. He's the right sort of Jewish and Israeli person, of course. Socialist economics and psyops from academia and the arts. Yeah, and again, you notice the language here, which he doesn't just state things. It's very, very, very specifically targeted. People in the universities that write books which go in the British Museum's library are basically plotting against you. They're all bad, okay, and they're elitists, yeah, they shut you out. It's not like you're allowed to write for the Daily Telegraph. Oh, hang on, no, that's not it, is it? Anyway, moving on, we must prepare for the long march back. This won't happen under Labour, so we have 4 years to get ready. Oh, right, so you're going to plot, are you? Plotting Jewish people doesn't sound so good to me. Yeah, anyway, Jewish people don't plot things, so that's okay. We do not underestimate the scale of the problem. The country is entirely different from just 20 years ago. Yes, you notice the notion of decades being thrown around here. Okay, yes, decades is 20 years ago is decades, but it's the shortest number of time, the shortest amount of time that you can have decades, isn't it? Really is 20 years ago. So we go back to 2005. The country is entirely different from 2005, is it? Don't really think so. Anyway, in that time, the population has increased by the size of London, with a growing Muslim minority. Yes, indeed. It'd be awful to have a growing Muslim minority. Why particularly are you pointing at Muslims, I wonder, Jake? Well, I wonder why it is. It's also got a very growing Hungarian minority. It's got a very growing Romanian minority. And it will also have a growing Jewish minority, because the Jewish people around the world have a very high birth rate. I'm not suggesting, that people are being outbred, because that would be a sort of conspiracy that, would be a kind of one of those kind of anti-Semitic tropes, and I wouldn't do that. Obviously, that would be bad, but it's okay for Jake to do that, obviously. Schools and universities have produced generations, there we go, of youngsters who know little about their history and nothing about their national religion. Again, I've debunked this over the last few days on a very, very broad level. But of course, for Jake, it isn't about the actuality of what someone like me might be doing. It's about what he can persuade you in when he's got his fingers crossed behind his back about what a dangerous person I am. Not like him, you understand. He's not a dangerous person. He wouldn't distort reality for a particular end or a particular higher goal. It's not what Jake would do, because to suggest something like that would be inherently anti-Semitic, and that would be very, very bad. Yes? Not to mention basic manners. Yeah, they go out on demonstrations and shout things about, genocide. How awful. Social media poses a challenge of its own. Yes, you get all those TikTok videos and stuff on Twitter of people being pulled from the rubble. And it's just basically propaganda, isn't it? Because there is no rubble and there are no people. No, definitely not. A return to liberalism as part of it. Yeah, but the post-war liberal consensus, which viewed national identity, faith and tradition as the seeds of Hitlerism, has become corrupted, beckoning an age of progressive radicalism. Yeah, and again, that's just word salad, isn't it? And the seeds of Hitlerism, where the hell has that come from? Well, it's just Jake throwing things around, because of course, Jake has a keen knowledge of history, and obviously has a keen knowledge of the rise of fascism, as we had in the 1930s, which was, put down by left-wingers in this country, or elitists who were plotting to, bring down fascism, which was a bad thing, obviously, because mainstream British media is represented by, the Rothermeres et al. With the Daily Mail and, to a lesser extent, the Daily Telegraph, of course, were very, very anti-Jewish and didn't want any Jewish people here at all, which is why we only ended up with the Kinder transports. And, we will have this whole thing about the Kinder transports. It's always held up as somehow some model of Britain being brilliant. But what reality with that, of course, is that we only wanted Jewish children because Jewish adults were dangerous people that would be plotting against the government. Of course they would do, because that's what Jewish people do, according to, the mainstream elitist position that the Mail and the Telegraph were taking in those days. But that's just, me knowing things, isn't it? Once again, Enlightenment principles are also important, but the contribution they made to the decline of religion, they are only part of the picture. Yeah, we've got to be religious, haven't we? We've got to be religious. Couldn't have a situation whereby atheists have a more realistic stance on whether or not following particular religions is a good idea. No, obviously not. We'd need good Christian values on that, whatever they are. I don't really know. Maybe they're like good Jewish values, whatever they are. I don't really know. But it just strikes me as essentially that they are pretty much the same as good Muslim values, because I can never, ever particularly see the difference other than, well, one of them says he was the Messiah and the other one says no, he wasn't. Yeah? That's about as far as that one goes. And all three of the Abrahamistic religions fully accept the notion of Moses as the lawgiver. So that's about as far as that one goes, isn't it? Unless, of course, you don't want to follow Moses, which is what the Christians tend to do. In which case, well, I don't know, Jake. Are they right in that? Or are the Jews right? Or are the Muslims right? Because the Jews and the Muslims would fully accept those notions of law in the Old Testament. The Torah, if you like. Complicated, isn't it? Well, no, best not to think about it. Jake certainly hasn't. We need a new direction that restores our old values and national story, but allows for the challenges of today. Fully agree with him there, of course. Of course I do. But my notion about what the challenges of today are do include a growing rise of the threat of fascism. Yes, which Jakes oddly doesn't quite seem to manage. The pursuit of reason and the separation of church and state are vital, but our Christian inheritance must be rescued from mockery, okay, and gently and moderately woven back into the social fabric. Oh, okay then. But, I mean, we do have a long history of persecuting Jews in this country. Is that part of what we should do in terms of having a state religion? Should we have a state religion? Perhaps we should bring back those blasphemy laws. Might be an idea. After all, we already basically do with the IHRA, which means that, we're not allowed to criticise, well, just anything about anyone that's Jewish or indeed the state of Israel because it's inherently anti-Semitic. Gets to be really tricky, doesn't it? I would argue that why don't we just have what are mainstream atheist views, because that way we wouldn't then have to bother with the notion of spurious people being right about particular religions, like, suggesting, for example, that because, something was written in a book from 7,000 years ago, that it has to be applied, to land in places like, I don't know, maybe Syria, eh? Maybe. Space must be made for other religions, including Islam. How magnanimous. Only Islam noticed you noticed there. I wonder why he doesn't mention Judaism there, because, that's a minority view as well, isn't it? Isn't it? Yes. With an overarching Christian Britishness, whatever that means. Any ideas what Christian Britishness is? I have no idea. Jake knows. I'm sure he should write more of an essay about what exactly it is, because I'm willing to bet that it'll be more woolly words about generations and decades and 2005. We need sensible answers to questions of race, class and belonging. Yeah, we really do, especially in terms of belonging, because I've always had the niggling feeling that maybe Jake, along with a variety of other people that follow his particular brand of the Jewish religion, actually owe their fealty to, well, a foreign power, which would be a bad thing. One of those things that he often likes to hint that Muslims do. But they're not properly British or Christian, are they? So maybe I'm entitled to that view just on that basis. Institutional, legal and economic reform are required, but it begins with education. You see, I told you it was all my fault. This is the work of a generation. Yeah, I don't know, is that a decade or two or three? Because traditionally a generation is every 30 years. That's how we work on that one, Jake, just for your information. Resting both on political leadership and the little platoons of civil society. Yes, the time to start is now. Yes, of course it is. The time to start is now. But as far as someone like me is concerned, you see, the problem that I have, at least in part, well, not just in part, in and around Mr. Simmons, I don't know, Jake, is of course that, he does seem to very much have an agenda which doesn't seem to fit in with my values, my Britishness and my values. I mean, just on the very day that he put this up in the Telegraph, or the Telegraph posted it, I should say, of course, Israel has said that they will no longer be sending aid into Gaza because things. Yes, and he posted this up as well. Yeah, Sunday. I've been saying there's no famine, in inverted commas, in Gaza for months. This morning, I thought I'd go on Snapchat, as you do, yeah, and saw the Ramadan celebration of the south of the Strip. Looks nice, yes. And you can see how lovely that looks. It's great, isn't it? But if we have a look at it from a wider angle, of course, we end up with a slightly different picture. And that, of course, is a neat metaphor for Jake himself, isn't it? Because when you look at it from the proper and correct angle, that wide-angle lens, you see exactly what's going on here. Yeah? I don't really want to be sold a pig in a poke, and I don't want to be told about my history from somebody that appears to have, well, certain loyalties that are elsewhere. But you see, instantaneously, what I'm doing now, of course, is by definition being anti-Semitic. So we end up with all of those sorts of problems. But we do have a long history of anti-Semitism in this country, and we do have a long history of a very, very troubled past. For example, in the 1930s, with the rise of fascism, when progressives, or the elites, as perhaps, Jake might want, all those teachers and everything, actually went out on the streets and fought fascism. And then later on, of course, like my dad did, actually fought it by, being in the army under the hot African sun, or maybe trudging their way around the war dead of Monte Cassino, whatever it might be, yeah? But there are problems inherently with that view of the world because, of course, again, we had riots in the UK in and around, Zionists, basically, one of the reasons why the State of Israel, again, history, simple history. Jake knows this, but of course he won't say it, of course, because it's an inconvenient history from decades or generations ago, if you like, yeah? But of course, we had riots in this country in the late 1940s. One of the reasons why the State of Israel was established was because the British public were fed up with Zionists blowing up British troops. They were terrorists, Menachem Begin, yeah? And the rest of them. They were terrorists who had a distinct ideological view about what they wanted, and they are still there. That is still basically the soul and the beating heart of a lot of Israeli policy. And once again, we are faced with the notion of people that seem to be cheerleading on a country that for some reason has, invaded Syria. Now, Jake has recently been suggesting about how awful the events in the Ukraine are, where one state simply, one state has simply invaded another. But I think he needs to apply these principles across what he's saying. You can slag me off for being a lefty by all means, but at least I have a reasonably coherent view of the world out there. I just think blowing people up is bad, full stop, yeah? And I don't really care if it's done in the name of God A, God B, or God C, and I would reject all of them, just simply because it does mean people being pulled from the rubble, and nobody should have to carry their child home in a bag at all. That isn't anything to do with any form of values that I can sign up to. Anyway, do have a glorious start to the week. Enjoy, if you can.